3.422, responses to premise 1. The foregoing strategies all accept, or at least do not challenge, the criterion of ontological commitment that lies at the heart of the indispensability argument. More fundamental challenges to the indispensability argument call into question that criterion, and hence premise 1. Some of these versions of anti-Platonism ask why true sentences may not contain irreferential singular terms, or why successful reference must involve the existence of an object in the world. Others challenge the criterion by demanding why the use of the existential quantifier should be interpreted to assert the existence of a real-world object, which is the value of the variable bound by the quantifier. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over 3.4221, free logic, which accepts the logically committing nature, or the ontologically committing nature of existential quantification, but denies that singular terms are ontologically committing. Although I've got to read this quotation from Michael Dummett that is so good. It's on my page 37, but it may be on a different page for you. And that is where I comment on the claim of the free logicians that singular terms are not ontologically committing. And I cite here Michael Dummett, who quotes the following paragraph from a London daily. Quote, "Margaret Thatcher yesterday gave her strongest warning yet about the dangers of global warming caused by air pollution. But she did not announce any new policy to combat climate change and sea level rises, apart from a qualified commitment that Britain would stabilize its emissions of carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas altering the climate, by the year 2005. Britain would only fulfill that commitment if other unspecified nations promised similar restraint." End quote. Dummett then observes, and I quote, "Save for Margaret Thatcher, air, and sea, there is not a noun or noun phrase in this paragraph incontrovertibly standing for or applying to a concrete object. Is a nation a concrete object or a gas? Obviously not. But neither then is a gas or a nation an abstract object. Taking the singular terms of this paragraph to be ontologically committing would commit its user to such strange entities as commitments, dangers, and the climate. If we are not ingenious enough to find acceptable paraphrases for such sentences, are we really committed to such bizarre entities on pain of the falsehood of our discourse? Well, I think evidently not. And so I find the claim of the free logicians that singular terms in sentences that we take to be true are not ontologically committing is a very plausible claim. I'm going to skip over as well 3.4222, neo-Meinongianism, which also holds that existential quantification is not ontologically committing. And I want to go directly to neutralism, 3.4223. And I think that at this point we will take a break and then come back and look at this school of thought. Neutralism, like free logic and neo-Meinongianism, rejects certain key assumptions about ontological commitment, which constitute the common ground shared by fictionalism, ultima facie strategies, and pretense theory with Platonism. The neutralist holds that neither existential quantification nor the use of singular terms is a device of ontological commitment. He is therefore unfazed by the Platonist conviction that various statements quantifying over or featuring singular terms referring to mathematical objects are, without qualification, true. Here, we want to ask what reasons might be given for adopting the Platonists' proffered criterion of ontological commitment. Consider first existential quantification. Jody Azuni challenges Quine's assumption that the existential quantifier of first-order logic does or should carry the burden of expressing ontological commitment. Quine thought it obvious that the existential quantifier of first-order logic is ontologically committing. Azuni takes Quine's argument for the triviality of the criterion to be that in ordinary language, there is carries ontological commitment, and that this idiom is straightforwardly regimented as the existential quantifier in first-order logic. The existential quantifier naturally reproduces the ontological commitments carried by there is or are in the vernacular. The problem for the Quinean is that in ordinary language, informal quantificational phrases do not seem to be ontologically committing. Consider Thomas Hofweber's list of some of the things we ordinarily say there are. Something that we have in common. Infinitely many primes. Something that we both believe. The common illusion that one is smarter than one's average colleague. A way you smile. A lack of compassion in the world. The way the world is. Several ways the world might have been. A faster way to get to Berkeley from Stanford than going through San Jose. The hope that this dissertation will shed some light on ontology, the chance that it might not, a reason why it might not. It would be fantastic to think that there are real objects answering to these descriptions. There's no evidence that the ordinary language speaker labors under the delusion that there are. Neo-Quineans may simply prescribe taking there is, are, and exists in such a way as to indicate ontological commitments. When we do, then we must correct the ordinary language speaker by either denying the truth of his assertion or offering a paraphrase that avoids the unwanted commitments. Azuni takes a very dim view of this sort of move on the part of the Neo-Quinean, characterizing it as a kind of philosophical chicanery. He writes, the literal onticist may also claim one can compel the ordinary person into trying to paraphrase. There are fictional mice that talk, one says during a discussion about talking fictional animals. Oh, so you believe fictional mice really exist? The philosophical trickster responds. I didn't say that. One responds, yes, you sure did. You said there are fictional mice that talk. What do you think there is means? One may now try to paraphrase, but what's happened is that the philosophical trickster has implicitly switched on usage. Now one is speaking so that there is, at least for the time being, does convey onticity, and the ordinary person isn't sophisticated enough to see how he or she has been duped. The trick is co-opting the evident truth of ordinary language expressions in order to imply the truth of a metaphysically heavyweight assertion. This is illegitimately borrowed capital. As we saw in our discussion of fictionalism, when the alleged ontological commitments of a statement are made plain by the Neo-Quinian, then it is often not at all obvious that the statement so interpreted is true and its denial false. Theodore Sider is more candid than the trickster. He says, ontological realism should not claim that ordinary quantifiers carve at the joints, or that disputes using ordinary quantifiers are substantive. All that's important is that one can introduce a fundamental quantifier which can then be used to pose substantive ontological questions, end quote. When one does so, one is no longer speaking ordinary English, but a new language, ontologies, whose quantifiers are stipulated to carve at the joints. If one stipulates that there is, are, is being used to indicate ontological commitments, then of course the neutralist, who is an anti-realist, will regard a statement like there are odd numbers as false, and the neutralist, who is a Platonist, will regard the statement as true. But neutralism has not thereby been defeated or shown to be irrelevant, for it is a claim about how we do commit ourselves ontologically in ordinary English, not in a foreign language like ontologies. Do we, in fact, commit ourselves ontologically through formal and informal quantifiers, as Quinians have asserted? The answer is plausibly no. In fact, the neutralist should protest the suggestion that there even is such a language as ontologies, which is spoken in the metaphysics seminar. All there really is ordinary language, and we can employ various linguistic and rhetorical devices to make it clear when we are speaking in a metaphysically heavy sense. But nobody, not metaphysicians, not ontologists, actually speaks the language of ontologies, for there just is no such language. Metaphysical discussions would quickly grind to a halt if every participant had to be able to furnish on demand paraphrases of ordinary language sentences involving unwanted ontological commitments when construed as sentences of ontologies. Of course, one may simply stipulate that formal and informal quantifiers are to be taken in a metaphysically heavyweight sense. But stipulationists trivialize the debate by simply requiring, in effect, that we must choose between realism and anti-realism about purported objects. We already knew that. What they cannot do is use the obvious truth of ordinary language locutions involving quantificational phrases as justification for accepting the truth of sentences in ontologies stipulated to carry ontological commitments. The point remains that without a refutation of neutralism, the indispensability argument, which is usually based on how we actually do use formal and informal quantifiers, cannot get off the ground. What about neutralism's view of the use of singular terms? It seems to be a datum of ordinary language that we frequently assert true statements which contain singular terms which do not denote existent objects. Consider the following examples. The weather in Atlanta will be hot today. Sherry's disappointment with her husband was deep and unassageable. The price of the tickets is $10. Wednesday falls between Tuesday and Thursday. His sincerity was touching. James couldn't pay his mortgage. The view of the Jezreel Valley from atop Mount Carmel was breathtaking. Your constant complaining is futile. Spassky's forfeiture ended the match. He did it for my sake and the children's. It would be fantastic to think that all of the singular terms featured in these plausibly true sentences have objects in the world corresponding to them. Examples like these are legion. In fact, I suspect that singular terms which refer to real-world objects may actually be the exception rather than the rule in ordinary language. How could it be that we are able to assert truths by means of sentences with empty singular terms? In order to get at this question, we first need to address the question, do vacuous singular terms refer? And in order to answer that question, we need to ask what it is to refer, or what is the nature of reference? This question is largely neglected by contemporary theorists. Almost all contemporary theories of reference are actually theories about how to fix reference, rather than theories about the nature of reference itself. The unspoken assumption behind most contemporary theories of reference is the presupposition that reference is a word-world relation, so that terms which refer must have real-world objects as their denotations. It therefore behooves us to look more deeply into the nature of reference. It is an experiential datum that referring is a speech act carried out by an intentional agent. Words, in and of themselves, engage in no such activity. Lifeless and inert, words are just ink marks on paper or sounds heard by a percipient. Absent an agent, shapes and noises do not refer to anything at all. If, for example, an earthquake were to send several pebbles rolling down a hillside, which randomly came to rest in the configuration, John loves Susie, the names, if we would even call them names, would not refer to anybody. As John Searle says, since sentences are considered in one way just objects in the world, like any other objects, their capacity to represent is not intrinsic, but is derived from the intentionality of the mind. An interpretive agent uses his words as a means of referring to something. Referring is thus an intentional activity of persons, and words are mere instruments. It is the great merit of Arvid Bové's new deflationary theory of reference that he takes truly seriously the fact, given lip service everywhere, that it is persons who refer to things by means of their words, so that words at best refer only in a derivative sense, if at all. Bové's significant contribution to our understanding reference is not so much that his theory is deflationary, as helpful as that may be, but that he furnishes a central schema for reference formulated in terms of the referring activity of agents. Bové proffers the following deflationary schema for reference, schema R. A refers to B if and only if A says something which is about B, where A always stands for a speaker. Though formulated in terms of agents rather than words, this account is truly deflationary because it does not attempt to tell us anything about the nature of reference itself. It leaves it entirely open whether reference is a relation, as Frege and Meinong assumed, or whether it is an intentional property of a mind, as held by Brentano and Husserl. Given schema R, we now ask, what does it mean to say that A says something about B, as stipulated on the right-hand side of the biconditional R? Bove proposes to analyze the expression about and then explain refer in terms of it. He offers the following schema as implicitly defining about, schema A. That ST is about T, where S, parentheses blank, is a sentence context with a slot for singular terms. Again, Bove's account of aboutness is extraordinarily deflationary. It does not tell us what aboutness is, but simply provides a schema for determining what a that clause containing a singular term, or presumably terms, is about. So, for example, that Ponce de Leon sought the fountain of youth is about Ponce de Leon and about the fountain of youth, because the singular terms Ponce de Leon and the fountain of youth fill the blanks in the sentence context, blank sought blank. Now, as a deflationary schema, it is very difficult to see how A provides an analysis of aboutness or serves as an explanation of reference, as Bove claims. Taken as an explanation of reference, A seems to get things exactly backwards. The reason why that ST is about T is because T is used by some agent to refer to T. It is natural then to provide an account of aboutness that is cashed out not in terms of linguistic expressions, but in terms of the speaker's intentions. What is wanted in place of A is something along the lines of schema A prime. A says something about, A says something S about B if and only if, in saying S, A intends B, where A intends B means something like A has B in mind. In accordance with R, I refer to B because I say something about B. And in line with A prime, I say something about B because in making my utterance, I intend B. On such an account, what some theorists have called speaker's reference becomes paramount. By construing reference in terms of the referring activity of agents and characterizing aboutness in intentional terms, we make an advance over neo-Meinongianism to arrive at a more satisfactory neutralist account. This account is consistent with anti-realism because successful singular reference does not require that there be objects in the world which stand in some sort of relation to a speaker's words. Of course, sometimes objects answering to the designations we use may exist, but in a surprisingly large number of cases, as our earlier illustration showed, there are no such objects. That does not stop us from talking about them or referring to them, for these activities are, at least in such cases, purely intentional activities. The neutralist, who is also an anti-realist, will thus stand in the tradition of Brentano and Husserl in thinking of reference not as a word-world relation, but as an intentional activity of agents, which may or may not have or correlative real-world object. Brentano insisted on the uniqueness of mental phenomena as object-directed or intentional. The object-directedness of mental reference does not imply that intentional objects exist in the external world. Quote, all it means is that a mentally active subject is referring to them. For Husserl, intentional objects are real-world objects about which one is thinking, but not all intentional activity has intentional objects associated with it. Rejecting Meinongianism, Husserl held that when no object exists, then the intentional activity exists, without any object. I can say things about non-existence, like Pegasus, the accident that was prevented, holes, or numbers, without committing myself to there being objects of which I am speaking. Thus, the non-existence of mathematical objects does not preclude our talking about or referring to them. Well, I realize that's quite a mouthful, but any question about neutralism, which regards existential quantification and use of singular terms as neutral, ontologically non-committing.
So I was actually looking for the citation in this wonderful book, but in Philosophical Foundations, you mention, either you or Moreland mentioned, that a lot of people try to reduce all metaphysics to simply language. And if that be true, how is this last section not that exact? You get where I'm going.
Yeah, this is a really great question, Quincy. I was never very interested in philosophy of language until I did this study of divine aseity. And then all of a sudden, its relevance just exploded in my mind. And I think the fallacy is those who try to read metaphysics off of language. They think that because we talk about things or because we quantify over things, therefore those things exist. And it seems to me that that is fundamentally illicit. You can't read your metaphysics off of language. And so in that sense, I think there is a huge difference between language and metaphysics. And I would disagree with those who would try to foist metaphysical commitments upon us by saying, for example, that we quantify over certain objects or that we refer to them. J.P. Moreland, my co-author, actually agrees with me on the theory of reference that I've just laid out, that reference is an intentional activity of agents and not a word-world relation.
Somewhat teleological.
What?
Somewhat teleological.
Somewhat, but the key would be intentional. That it's I have the intentional property thinking about Santa Claus. And we shouldn't think that that is a relation between me and Santa Claus, that I have this relation thinking about that relates to Santa Claus. No, it's an intentional property that it's hyphenated. Thinking about Santa Claus, sort of a hyphenated property. That is an intentional property I have, and it doesn't commit you to Santa Claus, even though I am thinking about Santa Claus.
I have a
Yes,
question.
Bill.
I'm grasping at this because I'm still trying to think all that through my head. But I just couldn't help but think of this postmodern move to really come at language and how much this would apply in that realm. Would you have any thoughts on that? I'm just thinking through it today.
I became much more sympathetic to a postmodernist viewpoint about how language can shape our view of reality and mislead us than I had realized before. I think that language can be extremely misleading in the ways that I've described. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, that I would agree with postmodernists in denying that there are objective truths about the world. But I am much more sympathetic to the idea that the linguistic frameworks that we construct may not fasten on to reality as it really is, and that these are just conventional products of the way we talk.
So do you think as Christians we should be obviously much more careful and much more like we should really take this very serious, like
when we're doing theology, yes, absolutely. We need to be more careful about this.
Yeah. Okay.
as Jody Azuni says, in your ordinary language, in the vernacular, just go on talking like you always do. It's okay. You don't need to make these kind of linguistic reforms. Just don't take them to be metaphysically heavy statements.
We do have a question from
Yeah.
Fred online. Dr. Craig's thoughts on the Son having derived aseity, given the begotten of the Father phrase in creeds. Is derived
Yes.
aseity possible?
I haven't talked about the doctrine of the Trinity. But if it is essential to God to exist a se, and if the three persons of the Trinity share the divine essence, then honestly, I don't know how you can say that the Son is begotten of the Father in his divine nature, or that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, because that would make them dependent in their being. And so I have real misgivings about this notion of the inner Trinitarian relations of generation and procession between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Maybe you can save divine aseity by saying it's a property of the Godhead, but not of the persons. But it does seem that it's a property of the Father. And surely if the Son is equal to the Father, he needs to exist just as a se, as the Father does, and not be a dependent being. So I have serious reservations about this notion of the inner Trinitarian relations of procession of the persons.
There is another question from online, from Nate. How would you explain the relationship between the doctrine of God's aseity and the ontological argument?
And the ontological what?
Argument.
I'm not sure. I don't see that it connects. The ontological argument, at least in Plantinga's hands, has to do with the possible existence of a being that is metaphysically necessary, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. But it doesn't mention aseity. So I don't think that it's directly applicable to the ontological argument, but more generally in the section I skipped over on perfect being theology, I definitely think aseity is a commitment of perfect being theology. A maximally great being will exist a se. He won't be dependent on anything else. But that's not necessarily part of the ontological argument. Well, let me wrap up this section then by saying, in sum, free logic, neo-Meinongianism, and neutralism constitute formidable challenges to the criterion of ontological commitment that comes to expression in premise 1 of the indispensability argument. Coupled with the formidable challenges to premise 2 of that argument, these considerations go to defeat the indispensability argument, which is the centerpiece of contemporary Platonism. In my studied opinion, both its premises are plausibly false. But in order to defeat the indispensability argument, so bold an opinion need not be defended. It suffices merely to undercut the warrant for one of its premises. Given how controversial the debate over contemporary Platonism is, no view can plausibly commend itself philosophically to the exclusion of all others. As I've tried to show, there's a plethora of philosophically defensible anti-Platonist alternatives to Platonism on offer today. In order to undercut the indispensability argument, the anti-Platonist need not defend any one of these views, but can recognize the viability of a plurality of viewpoints. I conclude that the challenge posed by Platonism to the doctrine of divine aseity can be met successfully. The doctrine that God is the sole ultimate reality is ultimately reasonable.